The executioner rose before the bells. He always did. Dawn crept into the city slowly, pale light pressing against stone walls that had seen more sentences than seasons. From his window, he watched the streets wake in fragments. A door opening, a cartwheel turning, a lone figure crossing the square with head lowered. Life continued here by habit, not by hope. He dressed in silence, the leather apron, the dark hood, folded, never worn until necessary. The gloves, thick enough to protect the hands, thin enough to feel the weight of steel. He treated his tools as others treated prayer. The blade was kept clean, balanced, sharp, but not cruel. He believed there was a difference. A dull edge meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant suffering. Precision, he told himself, was a form of mercy. That was how he explained it. That was how he endured it. The city had given him no name in public. Names invited conversation, and conversation invited doubt. In records and whispers alike, he was simply the executioner. A role, not a man. A function, not a soul. He accepted this willingly. Every craft required sacrifice. On execution days, the square filled early. People gathered not out of hunger for spectacle, but out of obligation. Justice, the council said, must be witnessed. Order demanded eyes. The executioner stood apart while the charges were read. He listened without listening. The words rarely mattered. Guilt had already been decided somewhere far from the scaffold, in rooms where men argued softly and slept soundly afterward. When the condemned was brought forward, the executioner kept his gaze low. Neck, shoulders, posture, these were practical considerations. Faces distracted the hand. That was the rule he followed. That was the rule that began to fail him. The first time he noticed it, he thought it coincidence. The prisoner was a middle-aged man, thin from weeks of confinement. When their eyes met, briefly, accidentally, the executioner felt a pause he could not explain. The look was calm, not resigned, not afraid, certain, as if the man standing before him understood something the executioner did not. The moment passed. The blade fell. The bell rang once. That night, the executioner cleaned his tools more carefully than usual. He replayed the day in his mind, searching for error. He found none. The sentence had been lawful, the procedure flawless. Still, sleep came slowly. Days later, it happened again. Different prisoner, different charge, same eyes, not identical in color or shape, but in weight, in presence, in the way they lingered, as though they were being memorized rather than erased. The executioner told himself this was the cost of long service. The mind, like the hand, grew tired. Patterns emerged where none existed. Yet as the weeks passed, the feeling did not fade. It deepened. Routine no longer brought comfort. Each execution felt less like an ending and more like repetition. The city's bells rang as they always had, but their sound seemed heavier now, pressing down rather than echoing outward. The executioner began to wonder, not about guilt or innocence, not yet, but about memory, about what remained after the crowd dispersed, about what followed him home. On the morning the bells rang again, he stood beside the scaffold and adjusted his grip. The wood beneath his feet was worn smooth, polished by time and weight. He had stood here countless times, yet for the first time, he felt as though the platform were watching him in return. And somewhere in the gathering crowd, unseen but expected, the same eyes were waiting. The executioner stopped looking at faces. At least, that was his intention. He trained himself to focus on details that did not speak back. The grain of the wood, the knots in the rope, the measured distance between the platform and the ground below. These were safe things, predictable things. Faces were not, yet faces insisted on returning. The next condemned was young, barely more than a boy. His hands trembled as they were bound, not from fear alone, but from confusion. The charges were read aloud, words shaped by law, heavy with certainty, but they seemed too large for the body standing beneath them. The executioner raised his eyes despite himself, and there they were again. Not pleading, not angry, not broken, watching. It was the same sensation he had felt before. As if something passed between them without sound. As if the boy were looking through him, beyond him, toward something already decided. The executioner felt his breath catch. He forced his gaze away. His hand completed its task. The bell rang. The crowd dispersed in low murmurs, relieved to return to lives still spared. But the executioner remained still long after the square emptied. That evening, he counted, not executions. He had long since lost track of those, but faces. He closed his eyes and let memory surface uninvited. Men, women, old, young. Faces that should have blurred together after so many years. They did not. Instead, a pattern formed. Different mouths, different scars, different hair, the same eyes. He told himself this was imagination, a trick of guilt formed too late to be useful. After all, the law was clear. The verdicts were signed. He was not the judge. He was not the accuser. He was only the final hand. Still, doubt began its slow work. He began to listen more closely during the readings, to notice hesitation in the voices of clerks, to hear how some charges were spoken quickly, others lingered upon. He noticed how witnesses avoided looking at the condemned. He noticed how often silence filled the space where certainty should have been. At night, sleep fractured. He dreamed of standing on the scaffold alone, the crowd gone, the city empty. In the dream, no blade rested in his hands. No rope, no tools at all, only eyes. They surrounded him. Not accusing, not forgiving, simply present, waiting. He woke each time before they spoke, if they ever meant to. Days passed. Another execution, then another. The eyes returned every time. The executioner began to wonder if they had always been there. Perhaps he had simply learned to see them. The city itself seemed unchanged. Markets opened. Bells rang for prayer. Children ran through narrow streets chasing nothing of consequence. Life, stubborn and unaware, pressed on. But the executioner walked through it as if through water, each step heavier than the last. He avoided mirrors, not out of vanity, out of fear, because on the rare occasions when he caught his own reflection, distorted in polished metal or darkened glass, he thought, for just a moment, that the eyes staring back at him were not entirely his own. And that thought followed him to the scaffold the next morning, where another name waited to be erased. Memory did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, a voice misremembered, a face recalled without a name, a moment that felt unfinished. The executioner began to revisit his past not by choice, but by pressure. Each execution pulled another thread loose. Each familiar pair of eyes opened a door he had sealed years ago. He remembered a man accused of theft. Thin, quiet, the sentence had come quickly. Too quickly. The crowd had seemed unsure that day, shifting in place, whispering instead of shouting. At the time, the executioner had dismissed it. Crowds were unpredictable. Law was not. Now he remembered the man's eyes. The same ones. He remembered a woman condemned for speaking against a guild. Her voice had been steady as the charges were read. She had stood straight, refusing to kneel. When she looked at him, there was no fear, only recognition. At the time, he had taken it for pride. Now he was no longer certain. He began to question the records. Quietly, carefully, not openly enough to draw attention. In the evenings, after the city dimmed and the streets grew thin with sound, he revisited old ledgers. Names, dates, crimes written in precise ink. So many verdicts rested on testimony he could no longer trace. So many judgments passed in haste. He told himself this was the weakness of age. That time softened details, made doubt easier than certainty. But the feeling would not leave him. He had believed, once, that the law was a wall. Solid, protective, unquestionable. A structure built to hold chaos at bay. Now it felt more like a door, and too many people had been pushed through it without being heard. The executioner noticed changes in himself. His hands still moved with practiced care, but his breath no longer matched their rhythm. He paused longer than necessary. He hesitated where he never had before. The guards noticed. They said nothing, but silence has a way of observing. One morning, before dawn, he arrived at the square early. Mist clung to the ground, softening the edges of the scaffold. For a moment, it looked almost peaceful, removed from purpose, almost innocent. He stood there alone and imagined the platform empty forever. No crowds, no bells, no names read aloud. The thought frightened him more than it comforted him, because if the scaffold stood empty, what would that make of him? He realized then that his identity had been built around obedience, around precision, around not asking questions that belonged to others. And now those questions pressed against him from every side. Were they innocent? How many? Did it matter if he never knew their names? The eyes answered none of this. They simply returned. That night, he dreamed again. This time, the faces spoke, not with words, but with silence that pressed inward. He tried to look away, but there was nowhere left to turn. He woke with the understanding already forming, heavy and unavoidable. The law had not always been right, and he had never been wrong enough to stop. The realization did not arrive with force. It settled. It took its place quietly, like dust on a surface long ignored. The executioner stopped trying to convince himself that doubt was temporary, that memory was flawed, that the eyes meant nothing. These explanations collapsed under their own weight. He knew now, not in the way one knows a fact, but in the way one knows a truth that reshapes everything around it. Some of them had been innocent, not mistaken, not misunderstood. Innocent. The word had no place in his work, yet it echoed louder than any sentence ever read in the square. He replayed moments he had once erased. A hesitation before a verdict. A witness who could not meet the crowd's gaze. A confession spoken too quickly, too neatly. He had never questioned these things. Questioning was not his role. His role had been to finish what others began. The law spoke. He acted. That was the balance, or so he believed. But balance requires weight on both sides. And now he saw how uneven it had been. Power above, silence below, fear filling the space in between. The executioner began to understand that the law was not a single voice. It was many voices layered together, some loud, some quiet, some silenced entirely. And he had listened only to the loudest. Each morning, the city greeted him the same way it always had. People turned their eyes aside. Doors closed gently, as if not to offend him. Children were pulled closer to their parents. He had once taken this as respect. Now it felt like distance. He wondered how many had watched him work and wondered the same thing he now asked himself. What if he is wrong? The scaffold no longer felt like a tool. It felt like a question suspended in wooden rope, and every time he stood beside it, the question stood with him. That day's sentence was ordinary, the crime unremarkable. The accused stood still, hands bound, posture calm. When the man looked at him, the executioner felt the final certainty settle. The eyes, there they were again. Not accusing, not pleading, knowing. For the first time in his life, the executioner felt the urge to speak, to say something beyond the ritual, to interrupt the order of things. But no words came, because he had spent his life without them. The bell rang. The crowd shifted. The law moved forward, as it always did, and he moved with it. Not because he believed, but because stopping would require a version of himself that did not exist. By nightfall, he was alone in his chamber, staring at his hands. They were steady, clean, unmarked, hands that had ended lives without ever touching truth. He understood then that realization was not an ending. It was a weight, and it would not leave him. The executioner never spoke his confession aloud. There was no audience for it, no judge to hear it, no sentence that could follow. It existed only in the space he carried with him, heavier than any tool he had ever lifted. The city continued its rhythm. Bells rang for hours he no longer counted. Footsteps echoed and faded. Smoke rose from chimneys and disappeared into the same sky that had watched everything. Nothing changed, and yet everything had. He walked the streets at dusk, moving through familiar paths that now felt altered. Walls leaned closer. Windows reflected his shape back at him, distorted by old glass. In every reflection, he looked older. He passed the square without stopping. The scaffold stood ready, patient, untouched. It did not accuse him. It did not forgive him. It waited. He understood then that there would be no punishment equal to what he carried. No prison for this kind of knowing. No blade that could divide guilt from memory. The law would continue. Another executioner would one day take his place. The city would endure, as cities always do. But the weight would not transfer. It belonged to him alone. That night, he sat in silence, listening to the city breathe. A cart passed somewhere in the dark. A door closed. A dog barked once, then fell quiet. The executioner closed his eyes. Behind them, the eyes waited. Not many, not few, enough. Morning came without announcement. The bell rang. Once, then again, and the sound carried through the streets, unanswered, fading into a silence that remained long after the metal stopped moving.